Hi, welcome everyone. We'll give a moment just for folks to sign on, get settled. While we're waiting, we always love to hear where everyone is tuning in from. So please use the chat. Remember to set the chat to everyone so that we can all see who is in the virtual room with us and where you are tuning in from. So you have to just adjust your chat settings to everyone. Oh, wow. Okay. We've got Lower Manhattan, Upper West Side, Ottawa, Pasadena, Connecticut, North Carolina, Philly, Dallas, Rhode Island. I made a joke a couple weeks ago about like we can officially start when we get to a certain number of states, but I forgot what
Mm.
number of states I said. So
I saw London in there too.
yeah, we've got some international. So thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Um, the usual notes about how we're going to communicate. Are on a webinar, so camera and sound are not enabled, but we will be active in the chat. My colleague Grace will be with you in the chat answering any of your questions that are about the museum, and then any questions that you have about our topic tonight. Grace will help field those to Annie and our speaker towards the end of the program. So as always, we always want to hear from you. You can also enable closed captions. Just press Show Captions, CC, down at the bottom of your Zoom bar. And that should be it. Please use the chat if you need assistance with anything technical. We will try to help out. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Annie Polland.
Thank you. Thank you, Kat. Good evening. So wonderful that you're here tonight from all over the country and the world. This is the third in a series of three programs where we have elevated questions you have asked on our tours and made them into programs. So one of the things that I love about the Tenement Museum is that everyone who experiences the Tenement Museum experiences it through the storytelling of an educator. And what's great about that, for those of you who've experienced it, is that you can ask questions live. And sometimes we don't know the answer to your question, or sometimes there's not time enough to answer the question to its fullest. And sometimes we just come together and we talk about what are the questions that keep coming up. And so we took three commonly asked questions and created a series and invited scholars who are experts on the topic to come and speak to us. So tonight we are asking a perennial question, a question that even as thoroughly as we'll get into it tonight, it's not going to be a question that disappears from the halls of the tenement. And that question is, what's in a name? How were names changed? Why were names changed at Ellis Island? Or let me tell you about a name that was changed at Ellis Island. So we decided to take this question and go to an expert. Kirsten Fermaglich, a professor of history and Jewish studies at Michigan State University, who wrote a book called A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, The History of Jewish Name Changing in America. You can see this book. It's an amazing cover. She and I engaged in conversation at the Tenement Museum. And we engaged in conversation at the Tenement Museum in the Rogoshevsky apartment. As you'll hear, this is an apartment of a family, like many families who lived at the museum, not lived at the museum, but lived at 97 Orchard and lived at the tenements, who at some point changed their name. Without further ado, we're going to go into the conversation. Again, it was recorded in November. It's approximately 42 minutes. And then Kirsten and I will be here at the end to ask your questions and answer your questions for a live conversation. One note is that there will be a section of the conversation where Kirsten references some name-changing practices in Europe. And since that conversation, she has found some new scholarship that actually changes the story. So we will update you about that. And finally, the only other thing I'll say is you will notice that my hair clip is askew. So I apologize for that. There was nothing we could do about it. I will tell you, you don't have to be in suspense. The hair clip will not fall off. Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to go to the program and I will see you in about 42 minutes. Coming all the way from Michigan to Kirsten, thank you so much for
coming all the way from Michigan to talk to us about name changing.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for bringing me to this museum, which I love. And it's so beautiful here. What you guys have done is amazing. So thank you very much. I'm thrilled.
We're only able to do what we do because of the work that you and other scholars do too. So we'll talk about this apartment in particular. But before we do, I want to talk about something that happens at the Tenement Museum probably every day. It comes from students. It comes from 80-year-olds. It comes from people of all backgrounds. But one of the things that people bring up is that names were changed at Ellis Island, specifically that their names were changed at Ellis Island. So, you know, a lot of us here at the museum, we explain, sometimes it's like not worth it to get into it because people cling to it so much. But tell me, first of all, were names changed at Ellis Island?
So there is no evidence of names being changed at Ellis Island. And that's really important, like for historians, right? It's like the evidence. So there's no evidence that they were. There is evidence, there were prohibitions against changing names. So that's significant. There is evidence, I mean, to me, the strongest evidence is always against this, is that there was no mechanism even for officials to change names, right? Like if you ever look at pictures of Ellis Island, right, there's manifests that they're checking. They're just checking people's names. They're not actually writing anything. And also they have no power. So people could leave Ellis Island and immediately just go and change their names. And we know that immigrants knew this because if you read immigrant memoirs, they talk about just changing their names. Like there's much more evidence from immigrant memoirs, immigrant stories of them, you know, sort of saying, oh, you know, I went to the sweatshop and people said, oh, you know, you should change your name from Rachel to Rose. That's a much better American name. And so they took that name, right? There's a lot of awareness that people could change their names. There's no power. America, the United States actually has a much more flexible name changing law than many places, certainly in Europe and many places in the world. The United States is much more flexible. It allows you to change your name for any reason, really, to have much more control over your names. And so even if there was like a rogue official somewhere at Ellis Island who just decided to change people's names, that had no power, right? People could walk off that island and call themselves anything they wanted. And there would be there was no power for the Ellis Island official to do that. They could easily change their names back, you know?
So what you're saying and what we know from the literature, from the memoirs, from family histories, is that people did change their names. There's no question about it. It's just that this idea of it happening in the specific place of Ellis Island is not necessarily the universal story. Yeah. But I guess then the question is, why do you think that came about? Like, why? Because, you know, with myths, it's always like, okay, we want to dispel the myth. But what's more interesting is to think about, how did the myth come about?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, so, and I will say this is always a problem if you get this in your tours. I have this in my, you know, talks, especially when I first started doing this research. People do have, you know, they cling to it. And I think some of it, for me anyway, in doing my work is, I think people, at a certain point, even though name changing was very common in the Jewish community and everybody knew about it, a stigma became attached to it. And I think people didn't want to admit to having changed their names, right? I think it signified a certain amount of betrayal, right? A certain amount of embarrassment or shame, and it became sort of easier to say.
It was imposed upon
on us.
There was a clerk,
right,
representing the United States, and
right.
that person
did it. It wasn't my fault, right? I didn't choose to do this, right? And I think that there's at least something to that that thing that sort of that created that kind of story.
And that sense of a pride in a name that has been lost and a shame in that some ancestor abridging that name, that would have happened more in the late 1960s, 1970s?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And actually, so one of the things I did do for my book was look, there's, you know, the famous joke. There's a joke that there's an immigrant, Sean Ferguson, right? How Sean Ferguson, how Jews got the name Sean Ferguson, right? They got so confused that they called it Shane Ferguson, my name, and they became Sean Ferguson.
Shane Ferguson is Shane Ferguson. I already forgot. And so I looked through joke books to see where I could find this joke showing up, right? And the joke doesn't show up until like the 70s, 80s, right? In the 60s, I found a version of that joke
in like 1967, I think it is, I thought a version of that joke being that an immigrant went to Hollywood and the whole way on the train practiced what his name was going to be when he changed his name to become an actor or a director or whatever. And then when the producer asked him, what's his name? He said, Shine Forgotten. Right. So it gives you a sense that's not an Ellis Island, right? It's a name change joke that dealt with movie stars and all kinds of things. And that's 67, right? So it's really, I don't think, I mean, there are some instances that maybe you see it a little bit earlier, but like, I think that kind of shame of betraying your family, I think that kind of emerges in like the late 1960s more as kind of like there's like a renewal of ethnic pride and ideas about ethnic belonging that become much more important in American culture.
And you could only have that, like you could only have a sense of ethnic pride once you felt sufficiently Americanized. In other words, once you've been accepted in America, or the perception of being accepted then gives you that sense of, well, there is this ethnic pride. And that was happening, obviously, not just for American Jews, but was part of the civil rights and Black power, and then the kind of Italian American identity and Irish American identity and Polish American identity and American Jewish identity that came up. But let's rewind again. So let's go back to this messy period where people are changing their names left and right, not at Ellis Island, but everywhere else.
Everywhere else.
And so that people did change their names, but in this apartment, what's really interesting, this specific family, the Rogoszewski family, who come in 1901 from Telš, Lithuania. They live in this very apartment. They move in around 1907, 1908, and there's the father, Abraham. There's the mother, who on the census is Fanny, but we know she was called Sippy. So there's first name changes and last. And then their children, Morris, Ida, Bessie, Sam, Henry, and Philip. The first 4 born in Europe, the last 2 born here, sort of common situation of bringing your family over. And what we learned 2 name changes in this family, for last names aside. We'll leave first names aside for now. One is that their last name apparently was Heller before they came over, but they changed it, I don't know if it was on the ship or where it was, to Rogoszewski, because they had an uncle who was sponsoring them, so they did that. Again, according to the story. Second part is that they changed their name around the 1920s, and at the instigation, or the suggestion rather, of the children to go from Rogoszewski to Rosenthal. So I want to ask you about those 2 name changes, but I want to rewind for a second and ask, how attached were East European Jews, like the Rogoszewskis, Hellers, Rosenthals, to their last names? And how does this play into it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something people have asked me a lot about. My sense is that, so in Eastern Europe, in Europe in general, for the most part, except for sort of Spanish Portugal and Sephardic Jews, Eastern European Jews take on their last names later than most other people. So, lots of peasants, right? There's a process of people taking last names, and Jews were among the latest to get last names. There's kind of another myth that Jews were given names. So as nations are created in the 19th century, Jews become citizens. They are being taxed. They need to be sort of recorded. They're being told to take on names. There's a myth that they are given names that are ugly, that are or humiliating or ridiculous. But when people, and other people have sort of said that's not a very persuasive myth. And also, if you look at the names that Jews
beautiful names, like Rose Garden and Bloom.
They're these, they call them in what's the name of the onomastics? They call them like artificial names, which I think is actually kind of negative about Jews. But yes, they choose these beautiful names out of nature, right? Like Rose Garden,
Schoenfeld, beautiful field. Yeah,
exactly. They choose really lovely names, and so I think much more likely that people selected names on their own. They selected beautiful names, and they did so in kind of patterns. They saw what other people were doing. I have people will ask me like, well, so people weren't that attached to these names because they were required to take them on, and so they weren't attached to them, and that's why it was easy to change their names. And I have seen some name changers, like when they've written about this in letters or newspapers, they would say things like, well, why should we stick with these names, right? They weren't our names. I think there may be something to that. I think that what people thought that they were changing, we can go backwards and sort of talk about why people are changing their names. But I think people know that they're not necessarily getting rid of the name. They see the name as it's a way to impose anti-Semitic discrimination on them. And the balance of keeping this name versus being able to get a job, right, is quite the balance there is clearly in favor of getting the job, But they do know, and they are aware that they are facing a connection to the Jewish community, to the outside world, right? And so more than being concerned about the name itself, it's what it signifies, which is some element of Jewishness to it, and I think that has different levels of attachment that people have, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, I mean, so even though a lot of these names, the last names that people had might have dated to just the late 18th century or the early 19th century, it was still a name that people had for at least several generations.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't like that they knew that what had been before. So that still was their reality, and we don't want to totally go too much in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to sort of see that this is not just people abandoning it, for nothing. There's a, they have to think about it, right? And it means something,
and it's
even if it's not
though,
like the name.
Because a lot of people, I don't know, like they don't exactly know what it means to be American or what names count as American. Because even thinking about Heller to Rogoszewski, like Heller to me sounds a little bit easier than Rogoszewski, but then let's talk about this name change from Rogoszewski to Rosenthal.
Yeah.
Like, again, if this was just about shedding Jewishness, wouldn't you choose something much, Rose or just something completely different than Rosenthal, which still was a pretty distinctively Jewish name.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they did it. You said in the 1920s, was that when they took the name Rosenthal? That is more surprising. I don't see as much of that in my name changes. Usually that is an earlier name change, but you do see a lot of families do that. My understanding or my interpretation of it happening earlier, and maybe even for this family because they lived on the Lower East Side, so they were definitely more working class probably, or poorer than the other folks that I'm looking at who tended to be more middle class. They are looking to fit in as best as possible in the economic status they want to be in. And for a lot of Eastern European Jews, so Rogoszewski is definitely a more Eastern European name, right? And Rosenthal is a more German sounding name, right? And so it had much more cachet. So you see a lot more people with Eastern European Jewish names changing them to German sounding names, or even more prestigious sounding names like Cohen, when they get here, because they're trying to fit in and get jobs in a Jewish environment, but one where there is discrimination against Eastern European Jews, right? And they want to fit in with German Jews, and it has more cachet in that way.
It's interesting, another family that we talk about, the Levine family, we recently learned that their name in Plonsk, now part of Poland, then part of the Russian Empire, had been Wishomirsky. And they even their ship's manifest says Wishomirsky on it, and then they get here pretty early on and change it to Levine.
Interesting.
So they're picking another identifiably Jewish name, but one that maybe has less of an immigrant cast to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a lot of nuances and valence, like that the sense that this is an American name and this is a Jewish name. There's a lot of stuff in between.
Absolutely. And you find, and I think about this with first names a lot as well. I mean, we sort of, I looked at both first and last names, and I think this is something, that when immigrant Jews are choosing names for their children born in America, they choose names that sound, I think, to them like the most English names they can possibly think of. There was just an article about this in the foreword, right? And so they choose Irving and Stanley and Arnold, right? They choose names that are English, like last names, basically, that sound super English and,
but
American to them.
Jewish names.
But they totally become ghettoized as Jewish names. But the interesting thing, of course, is that they're living in a Jewish immigrant environment, and everybody around them has these names, and they're all trying to fit in that space, right? And that's how I would understand like a change from Rogoszewski to Rosenthal, in part, is that you are looking at your peers, right? And you're trying to see what are the good names? How can I fit into this particular space?
How can I fit into other communities of American Jews, as opposed to just becoming, like, leaving the community? So, and I think that's one of the things that comes through in your book throughout, talking about Jews throughout the 20th century and name changings, that it's rarely about pure escape from your identity, but rather or that you can change your name in such a way and change the name of your family member so that you're still part of the Jewish community, but for the sake of navigating a broader world, you've chosen this name or you've abridged your name. But let's go back to this, thinking about your study shows pretty definitively that it was the second generation of Jews that really, really engaged with name changing, especially in terms of the sources that you were looking at.
Yeah, so the sources I'm looking at are from the New York City Civil Court. And in those petitions, absolutely, they are second generation, like 77% of them are native-born, second-generation American Jews, which I think is important to say, because I think a lot of times people hear second-generation and they actually think it's like third,
Right.
Second generation
when
is
historians
people born
use,
in the U.S., right? And so, if I had looked at other sources, so in 1906, immigrants can change their names on naturalization petitions. I didn't use naturalization petitions. If I had, I would have probably found many, many immigrants deciding to use that. I didn't do that. And also you can see like memoirs, like there are plenty of people who just change their names informally. You don't have to use these New York City Civil Court petitions in order to change your name. So there's multiple other ways where people could and did change their names.
One of my
Jews and not
favorites,
Jews.
and that we talk about this with school children too, that a lot of the kids, there was like, I think a New York Tribune article about this in like 1902 or 1903, that the kids go to school and the teachers change the name.
Absolutely.
Because the teacher can't pronounce it or the teacher is trying to help. And then sometimes the parents say, okay, we'll take that too. Of. And we also know that in some of the birth certificates we've looked at, if you look at the birth certificates, the name will say something like Pearl or, but then when you look at the census for that same child, 8 years later, it's Pauline. So, which also tells us that a lot of times, especially with first names, people are navigating the world with maybe two names, which is also important.
My family has this story, which again, may be a story, maybe manufactured, but my grandfather, definitely you hear this story from other people, didn't know his name was Barnett until he went to school. Like they just always called him Ben, right? And then he goes to school and they call Barnett and he's like, who's that, right?
And no one's using that name to name after anymore, is my guess.
Barnett now, right? Like that's
right.
And he always went by Ben, except for his coworkers. Like I think in school he was Barney, and his coworkers called him Barney because that was his official name. And there's like a whole family lore about why this happened. But I think it is, and I think in terms of thinking about Jews is perhaps different from other ethnic groups. And I haven't looked as closely into other ethnic groups thinking about names, but it is true that Jews did frequently sort of navigate a religious name and a secular name. And so it is true that there may have been something in sort of Jewish culture that made that dissonance maybe a bit easier, although I haven't
and
really
not
looked
totally
at a lot of other
unfamiliar
groups about
from
that.
how things might have been in Poland, for
Right.
example, where there would have been. So going, let's say it's the 1920s.
Okay.
You're looking at the New York City Civil Court records,
Right.
which you talk about so beautifully. One of my favorite, I'm going to go to broader trends, but I'm going to make you tell the story. I think the name is Louis Goldstein. A man named Louis Goldstein wants to change his name. So tell us about Louis Goldstein.
So Louis Goldstein goes to court. So the name change process in here is that you do have to go before court. Now it's not true, but back then you had to have a petition and you go before the court. And Louis Goldstein is the judge also.
Same name.
So Louis Goldstein wants to change his name, and Judge Louis Goldstein says,
What's wrong with Louis Goldstein?
Yeah, he says, you say you want to do this because it will aid you in there are actually two judges who say similar things about this, but you say you want to do this to help you advance your career, but clearly the name Louis Goldstein does not prevent against having a good career, right? There are definitely
And did he grant the petition at that point?
he did.
Oh, he did. Okay.
And I can't remember whether it's Louis Goldstein or the other one, but there's one where the judge grants the name change petition, but sort of says this basically, and I don't have the language, but let his people. He is an embarrassment to his people. Let him change his name, and we will be done with him, or something like that.
So there was some commentary.
There is, yeah. So I read, and both of those court petitions I had found from a secondary source, but that person sort of hinted that there might have been Jews trying not to have their cases heard by Jewish judges, right? For these exact reasons that they might be judged for this decision.
Let's go back to that. I want to pin that for a second, but go back to kind of the broad trends, because again, and I made you delve into one specific story, and these sources are so rich with stories. But again, what you did, I think, so beautifully is not just mine them for stories, but really analyze them and be able to show broader trends, how Jews compare to non-Jews in changing their names, for example, and then how that changes over time for Jews. So tell us a little bit about how Jews compare to Italians or other non-Jewish immigrants changing their names.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is that I trained as an American historian, and I sort of moved into Jewish history. And with this being my second book, I sort of thought, well, I'll be moving back. Yes, I will be finding Jews, but I'm going to be finding, everybody, right? The New York City court petitions should have all people. And I was really struck by the numbers of Jewish names, just walking into the courthouse and just kind of eyeballing things. It was overwhelming. And in fact, I don't have it in the book. I wish I had, because they had indexes that you could use to find individual names. They weren't really well kept, so I didn't wind up using them very much. But when you looked at them, you would just have, it was done by letter, and you'd have under C a page of Cohens. Mm-hmm. And if you went to the R's, you would have a page of Rosenbergs and Rosenthals, and it was really, really striking, just the volume of Jewish names. So even though I went kind of thinking I was going to be seeing all people, and I did, absolutely, there are people with Italian names, and there are people with Greek names. Specifically, Italians are the next group. And so I did some comparisons, and I found, in terms of looking at the numbers, Italians show up in the petitions roughly about their number in the city, right? So about, I think it was 15 or 16% of the New York City population at the time was Italian American or Italian, and that's roughly what you see in the files. And Jews instead, you might say Jews, there were a lot of Jews in the city, right? 25 to 30% of the city at this time, and yet Jews are represented double, the petitions 60%. Show 60% are, 55, 60% or more are Jewish petitioners, right? So, and I think that this doesn't necessarily mean that Italian Americans aren't changing their names. They are. But in these petitions, in this way, these petitions in particular really attract Jewish petitioners.
So why are Jewish petitioners, why are there more Jewish petitioners than non-Jewish in a way that's disproportionate to their population?
Yeah, so some of it, and these are interconnected reasons, right? So a lot of it is that you have to go back to this time, and we're talking about the 20s through the 40s, okay, right? 40s through the 50s even. People looking for middle-class jobs are mostly having to do so filling out application forms and going to employment agencies. And this includes jobs like being a clerk or a secretary, or an engineer or right? All kinds of middle-class jobs, all the way through pink-collar jobs that women are getting, all the way through to sort of high-powered jobs like engineering and being a doctor. All of these are things that are, and going to college.
So unlike parents who are working in factories, so these are not factory jobs, these are not construction jobs. Middle class then meant an office job of some.
Exactly. If you are going for an office job, right, if you're looking for a working class job, you're much more likely to get a job based on word of mouth, based sometimes on an appreciation of your body, right? You might go to a street corner and be chosen to work as a longshoreman. Union job, maybe you have a friend or a brother or someone from your hometown back home who recommends you for a job.
And those people hiring you are maybe of your own culture, so in which case having your real name, the name that was given to you by your parents, that name is going to help you probably more in a working class job at the time, because the working class jobs were all often tied to ethnic background.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a lot of times it doesn't matter, right? I think a lot of times they're not necessarily, I don't know, there's something about them. I think that's true. I also think that because they're not using forms and employment, because they're not using those kind of bureaucratic forms, much less of it just depends on looking at a name, right? Much less of the sort of selection and thinking about it depends on kind of what you write down on a piece of paper, in the same way. But yes, for sure, I think both of those things are true. Jews are the sort of European white ethnic group that is the most at this time looking to enter the middle class and being successful doing so, and also using the schools. I mean, I should have said a lot of this is about higher education. A lot of people are doing this either when they are going to college or when they're graduating from college. I mean, there's kind of anecdotal evidence that sort of describes a lot of Jews, their junior, senior year of college, sort of talking and deciding they're going to change their names when they graduate, right? It's very much identified with getting applications to college or applications to graduate schools, professional schools, things like that. And all of these are places where Jews are looking for jobs in a way that is much more significant, or in a way that's much more numerous than people of other ethnic groups like Italians. I'll also say that gender plays a really important role in this as well. So Jewish women are looking for jobs outside of the home at rates much higher than Italian women. And Jewish women are very important in these name change petitions. They begin, when I first started looking at like 1887, there's very few women. But by the time you get to the 1940s, women are roughly, I believe they've moved up to 50% of women and girls are, because there's a lot of children on these petitions as well. I believe that by the 40s, they've moved up to about 50% of the name changers, right? So you see a lot of women. And I actually think that the differential between, Jewish women looking for jobs out on the market as secretaries, as, whatever kind of sort of pink-collar stenographers, and even some more creative jobs, sometimes advertising, sometimes, entertainment, right? But they need those jobs. They need their names to look good, even if they're going to change them when they get married a few years later.
So to what extent then is the name changing of the second generation and perhaps third generation connected to anti-Semitism?
Oh, yeah. Well, so that's the other part to it. So if in the one hand, when I sort of said that there are sort of intersecting reasons why Jews are doing these petitions more, part of it is that they are looking for these middle class jobs. They are looking to go to school. That is the engine for their, middle classness, right? Are these avenues. And at the same time that they are doing that, they are actually frightening and disturbing the white Protestant, usually Americans, who are alumni of those colleges or are administrators of those colleges or are in the legal profession or are working in advertising or banking or whatever are the white collar jobs where Jews want to go. And so they actually begin to use, they are using those application forms and sometimes developing those application forms as a means of keeping Jews out. They don't want Jews there. So this becomes very public and very, very obvious at places like Columbia and Harvard that begin the process of creating application forms. So the modern application form for universities and colleges that we know today is pioneered by Columbia in 1917 to keep Jews out, right? So we moved from like a half-page application form to like multiple pages where you answer all kinds of officious questions about who your father is and what he does and all these kinds of things, including questions about whether anybody in your family has changed their name.
So how did people get by this? So let's say, I was curious about that because I was reading about, like, let's say I changed my name, but then they're asking me what was my mother's maiden name and what was my father. Did people just put their different name, so if I change my name to whatever, let's say I change my name to Smith, would I then say my parents' last name was Smith too? Would you kind of retroactively?
It's a good, so, I think that in the petitions that I see, you absolutely do see parents and children changing their names together.
Okay.
Absolutely. Like that definitely does happen. On the application forms, I actually don't know whether people sort of told the truth and kind of outed themselves, or whether they, because sometimes they'll say, does anybody in your family ever change their name, right? And then you're kind of like, so I don't know. And I sort of talk with my students about this when I do this, like, would you lie to do this? And then how would you feel? Like, I think even if people did not, and this is why it's probably a minority, it's definitely a minority of Jews who actually change their names. Like, while this is thousands of people, there are millions of Jews, right? So, this is not the majority of Jews. And
so while the majority of people changing their names in New York were Jews, the majority of Jews did not change their name.
That's exactly right. And it's important to say this is a minority. Yeah. But what I think is important is not only that yes, it's a minority who do it, but then that has major impact on their future, on their children, their grandchildren, right? Those names stay. But it also has real impact on the community that watches people that they know changing their names. And also it winds up affecting the whole community because they apply for these jobs and they're asked these questions, right? And so everybody in the community has to kind of make this decision. Am I going to change my name or not, right? And so even if it's a minority of people who actually decide to do this, it becomes really an issue for the entire community to engage, right?
Yeah, and so in a way, like, I'm just realizing that it's like name changing is less the issue than the way in which anti-Semitism is prodding you to even consider changing your name or not. So tell me a little bit about this anti-Semitism then in this time period, and how does it compare to discrimination other groups might have for various reasons?
I mean, so it is. I mean, it's certainly not violent. Jews do face violence at that moment, right? In the 1930s, for example, there is an upsurge, and in the 1920s as well. There's an upsurge of violent anti-Semitism as well, and people are uncovering more and more research about that now. What is happening for Jews in this particular telling is institutionalized, and it is fairly pervasive, I would say. I mean, it really sort of covers, if Columbia and Harvard begin doing this in 1917, 1918, by the 1920s, it has spread to universities and colleges all across certainly the Eastern Seaboard, other parts of the country, sending Jews to other parts of the country, right? It does become...
Yeah, we have a family story from Wisconsin where, like, I think it would have been my grandmother's nephews, but they were my grandmother's generation, basically 3 brothers. 2 went to medical school, and they told the third, we already have 2 of you.
Wow.
Right? So, like, again, I don't know the wording and how that wording was changed, and that's Milwaukee 1930s, 1940s.
There's an entire phenomenon that's called migratory Jewish students, which is basically people living in New York. I've found them, done some research at Michigan State, right? They're there. You see, these Jews from New York and New Jersey popping up in Michigan, East Lansing, Michigan, right? It's because they can't get their positions. So it's definitely pervasive. I mean, I think for Jews, and my research is only New York, and that's really important to say. People will, not always, but people will frequently ask me, is this, does this happen elsewhere? And I did not do a study of elsewhere myself. I have evidence that is both there. So there was a group of men and women who did a study, sociologists who did a study of LA Jews in 1946 and found very similar findings. And I've seen, there's also a study of St. Paul, Minnesota, Children of the Ghetto, that also sort of found significant levels of name changing among Jews, especially sort of middle class Jews, kind of seeking advancement. I think I would kind of, and then I found letter writing and stuff like that. I think I would say probably at least big city throughout much of the country. I think everybody is engaging these kinds of discriminatory practices and thinking about solutions. I think that this happens pretty broadly throughout the country. And the fact that I found it so much happening in New York, where there are so many Jews, right, might suggest that, it exists in lots of places, right? You might think Jews are more accepted and more, sort of stable in New York, but in fact, they are just as, if not more, threatened by anti-Semitism. I'm sorry. I think I diverted myself a little bit.
No, it's great. I think it
sorry.
just shows how rich and resonant these questions are, and how entangled they are. And it's not just one thing or another thing. These are things that are affecting people's daily lives and in a variety of ways.
That's right. I think you were asking me
how does it compare
to other groups, and so it does not look like the violence that is visited on people of color to nearly the extent, right? Although, as I say, there is violence against Jews, but it's not, Jews are still considered white as voters, right? Their ability to vote, their ability to sit on a jury, all kinds of things that were, a part of the American racial hierarchy at this time are not affecting Jews. At the same time, I think that for Italian Americans and Catholic Americans, I think you do see some similar discrimination as well. I think that, again, because Catholic and Italian Americans are not necessarily looking for the same jobs, the discrimination is not facing them to the same extent. So it really is very intertwined, right? Because Jews are seeking this advancement in large numbers, they are then being faced with sort of substantial discrimination that does really affect their lives, right? It is not violent, but it is nonetheless, this question of like, what do you do on this form? Are you actually welcome? Should you even apply there, right? How can you sort of navigate this world? There's like a bureaucracy that's really kind of stacked against them.
And it's kind of like this. It's not necessarily whether you can go to college, but it then becomes how do you navigate to figure where you can go to college. It's not can you get a job in your field as opposed to how can you strategize to figure out.
Yeah, I do think in terms of the field, I do think there are some fields that
like being a historian.
Yeah,
being an American historian,
being an American historian.
Which is so symbolic, right? Because there's probably like proportionally not that many people who aim to be an American historian then or now.
Right, yeah.
So let's just say that.
Right, yes.
Very good reason.
Definitely.
But like that is the like gatekeeping thing. Like, can you be truly American?
Yes.
And study American history with a name like Dubinsky
and there were people questioning that, right?
Yes,
By the second half of the 20th
but
century.
like another strategy though too that can work more in a place like New York is like, let's say you've gotten into law school and you've graduated, but you can't get into certain firms, but you can be a lawyer serving the Jewish community, or and that kind of can replicate itself in a variety of ways.
Yes.
So it's like it's like this almost. The constant need to be negotiating and strategizing, not so much any government regulations as much as what is happening in institutions, in business, in, again, universities, real estate, where you can live, where you can buy homes or not. And so that then shapes, so all of these things are shaping this generation, whether or not they change their name.
Absolutely. I do want to say, because I want to sort of add to this, because this is a really important part of how I see the work, is that all of this is true, but I want to sort of make clear it's not the state imposing this, right? So it's not like Jim Crow, where it is, sort of the state saying, yes, we are segregating these groups, but the state is absolutely allowing this to take place. It is allowing name changing, right? It is being very flexible and saying, sure, go ahead and change your name. Very few people get this rejected, and it becomes this way to change their names. But the state is also permitting all of this discrimination, right? And it was challenged and then permitted. And that's a really important component of this. It's all allowed.
And that, I think, takes us to a really important turning point a little bit, right? At the post-war era, where you start to see civil rights organizations across the board try to then engage the federal government in regulating this discrimination that's playing out.
Absolutely.
And what's the role of Jews or Jewish Americans in these organizations?
Absolutely. So and one chapter of the book is because the federal government is kind of out of reach in the 1940s and 50s because of Southern Democrats sort of waylaying all civil rights legislation. After World War II, it is mostly happening on a state level, and there's a huge push after World War II throughout the states to put on the books anti-discrimination laws. And actually, so my research is mostly in New York, and then it is in New York that the first anti-discrimination employment law is passed, and then a few years after that, one of the first anti-discrimination laws in education is passed, and Jews are central to that passage. They're central to writing the laws, and as they do so, they make things like application forms asking questions about name changing in your family illegal, and they actually go through and monitor application forms to ensure that people aren't putting these kinds of discriminatory questions in their application forms on their applications for college and things like that. And Jews, and it is their experience, their personal, a lot of them are Jewish lawyers with their own personal experiences of either changing their own names, having people in their communities change their names, right? But they see that as one of the fundamental ways that they've been discriminated against, and they put that in the law.
And those laws, I think it's important to note too, is that it's not just that these no anti-discrimination against Jews, it's no discrimination for anyone. So that, in other words, you're changing American law more broadly.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they are working together with Latino groups, with African American groups, with Japanese American groups, with other labor groups. This is part of a civil rights coalition that sees these kinds of practices as being much broader, much affecting multiple groups, and that they need to be sort of brought together and fought together. Absolutely.
And I just want to pause there just because I think it is so important to kind of note that so much of civil rights and legislative change in this country comes from groups coming together to pool experiences, to pool resources in order to change laws. So let me just ask one more question, just to conclude, so we get a formal conclusion. But like, when, and we got to this a little bit before, but like, we talked about name changing subsiding, or we didn't talk about name changing subside. When did name change subside? Name changing among American Jews subside?
Yeah. So really, so the numbers stay much higher in the years after World War II than I think people imagine they will. So they go down. World War II is the high point, and they go down by like the 1950s, but they still stay at much higher elevated levels throughout the 50s and 60s, which I think can suggest that there is continuing anti-Semitism, fear of anti-Semitism, you know, in New York City, certainly. I don't see the numbers. Jews are still disproportionately represented really until the 1980s. But it is interesting that the numbers of name change petitioners in general tends to go down, right? So by the 60s and 70s, and certainly by the 80s, the numbers of name changers just kind of really are plummet, right? And it does not seem like it's a very successful thing, and certainly Jews are no longer. So I would say like 70s, 80s is really the moment when Jews are no longer disproportionately represented, and the numbers of name changers go way down. They go up again in the 2000s. So this was not initially part of my research, but then friends of mine said, oh, you should go back and check again, especially after 9/11. You should look and see what happens after 9/11. So my last chapter actually looks at another swell of name changing. So if it goes down in the 80s and 90s, by the 2000s, it's way back up again in the thousands. And it is much more people of color and much more people who are working class changing their names. So the entire dynamic of what name changing was for Jews in the middle of the 20th century has changed. But at least 2012 was the last year I looked at. But there were thousands of people changing their names, and well, at least over 1,000 every year, and they're doing so for different reasons, but it is still people who are facing discrimination in New York City. I would say that's the constant.
That's the constant.
That's the constant.
And it'll be interesting, and it suggests there are moments at which there's more of an inclusivity and expansiveness with regard to American identity that allows people to keep the comfort of their names. And then there are moments at which that changes. And so it's beyond the scope of this conversation to talk about much more than that, but other than to say what a like, you know, just such an illuminating way and also accessible way for us to study the ways in which discrimination impact daily life and family life, which is something we talk about all the time here at the Tenement Museum, regardless of background. So I want to thank you. And now I think we have time to go for questions. So we'll go to questions, and we're excited to hear from you. So you can type your questions into the chat.
Hi. And hi, Kirsten.
Hey.
So we are ready for your questions. Please type them in the chat, or Grace, if you want to let us know if there are any questions for Kirsten.
Yeah, we got a couple questions. The first one was housing discrimination a driver for name changes in the Jewish community?
That's a really interesting question. I did not see very much of that. I think the reason that I didn't see very much of it was that I was looking in New York City. And I think that, I mean, there was discrimination against Jews, certainly in suburban communities. And I think that's where you would see it more. And actually I did, my mentor studied suburbs, and she sort of said to me, you should go look in the suburbs. And I didn't do that. Places like the Bronx and Brooklyn did sort of have that kind of middle class cachet. I did not see anyone that it just didn't show up in my petitions. I looked in Manhattan. I didn't look, I could have looked in the Bronx or Brooklyn to see whether there were more sort of people talking about that, but I did not see that. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist. I think it's a really interesting question, actually. I've never been asked that question. Jews certainly do face housing discrimination, but I didn't see anybody saying that it was significant for housing discrimination. That's a great question. And someone else could go look at suburbs, and it'd be really interesting to sort of see whether there's more reported than I found.
There's a question too that I'm seeing about the differences between like name changes that were kind of just a clear cut use of like a more waspy name as opposed to a kind of a Jew changing their name to a like less Jewish, but not, but still maybe identifiably Jewish name.
I did not. So that's an interesting question. There's a lot of different valences. It's kind of hard to figure out how to kind of parse those. And I actually did. I mean, I would find, that somebody named Gold would change their name to Gould, and somebody named Gould would change their name to Green, or, whatever. Like what one man's gold is another man's Gould, right? Like there were all these, and a Goldberg would change to Gold, right? So it's kind of, I didn't necessarily parse that. I would say that what you do see, which I think if you um, live in a Jewish community, you can think about this, or even if you look at the front cover of my book, actually, which has name changes that I actually found in my petitions, it was really very common for Jews to use number one, the first initial, right? So it'd be very, very common to sort of have a Cohen become a Kane or a Corwin or something that sounded like Cohen, right? Or excuse me, that had that first letter. Um, Sort of lopping off the end became a very common way to change the name. What was uncommon, I would say, would be name changes that just did not use the first initial and that really, really changed it completely. That did not happen that as often. I saw much more frequently sort of shortenings using the same first initial. I found one person named Solomon who changed their name to King, right, as like a cute joke, right? But very little of that, and very little. And I did sort of play with a thesis that maybe that was sort of something that other ethnic groups did more, or that other ethnic groups did translations. Like Jews didn't do a lot of translations, for example, maybe a few, but that was less common than just kind of like a shortening. But I didn't do any kind of systemic look at that to be able to answer the question. I think Jews did a combination, but they didn't tend to take on very frequently like a name that would be like a prestigious, like a Cabot or a Washington or a Lincoln or something like that. They didn't tend to take on names like that. They took on names that made them invisible. They took on names that would not make them noticed. I think that's the easiest way to say it.
And there started to be patterns too, like you talk about Rabinowitz become Robbins. And so then Robbins almost becomes like a name that maybe was still like a Jewish name, but
Yeah, sometimes
still.
Rose Green. I mean, there's a lot of names like that I sort of that there was one article that was done by sociologists that sort of there was a term that they used, but like, that there were ways that Jews could know, or that non-Jews, anti-Semites would kind of be, maybe that's a name, right? But yes, there would definitely be patterns and commonalities, and people would kind of find patterns. But to me, and this was really important in the way I thought about it, is that it really was about being anodyne. It was about not wanting to be noticed, because names like Rabinowitz or Goldberg would get you noticed and would get you negative attention that might lose you a job or some other kind of a promotion, application. And so it was really about not being noticed. It was about being invisible, the most anodyne name you could find so that you wouldn't face discrimination.
So another question that came up that has to do actually with not becoming invisible or not wanting to become invisible after World War II, when relatives were trying to find other relatives, was there ever, or did you ever find any evidence or hear any stories of the fact that someone changed a name, making it hard to then reunite and find relatives?
I mean, I'll say for sure that when I've given I've given lots of talks to genealogical groups, right? Name changing really is very interesting for people who do genealogy. And I'll say that they will tell me that, right? That they hit brick walls. I mean, true for my family as well, right? The name change, my mother did not find our name and our family, lots of family documents until she changed the spelling just a little bit, right? From what it was changed from, right? It was a Vermoglich with a V and
Mhm.
an O with an umlaut. And then she found us, right? Then she found all kinds of documents from my family, including from the Warsaw Ghetto, right? So I think that I didn't find a lot of that after the war. I did find one or two, I did find some Holocaust survivors who changed their names. I found one really very poignant petition from a family after the Holocaust who changed their name back. They had been they had been worried about anti-Semitism in the United States, and then they found that they attracted more kind of ridicule and humiliation from having changed their names, and so they wanted to change back. Um, uh, so I did not find a lot of Holocaust survivors who changed their names, but they were also immigrants and they could have been using naturalization petitions. So that doesn't necessarily tell us anything. I'm sure that it made it hard for people to make connections. I'm sure that that happened.
Um, Someone is saying, did you ever encounter in your research a family that had their name changed for them by an immigration officer? Um,
I did not. No. Um,
This was actually, I'm sorry. So this was someone that is from Canada, and they're talking about ancestors given odd names as they arrived in Halifax or Montreal. Simantov was deemed unpronounceable and changed to cement. But so I guess that's a question too, is like, are there similar myths? So again, I don't know if in Canada is the same thing, but curious about that and curious whether the same phenomenon here might have taken place in Canada as well, in the
yeah,
sense of people saying the name was changed by an official, but it not happening, or were names actually changed by officials in Canada?
it's such an interesting question, and I really am apologetic. I mean, I usually use the excuse that I didn't go to Europe and I don't necessarily have all the language facility, but I certainly could have gone to Canada, and I did not. I have an example of a Toronto family, a family from Toronto that did change their name. But I don't know enough to answer that question, so I think I should. I should.
It's still a good story. I like the
It's a good
cement
story. It's a
story.
good story. It's a good story. And it makes me think again that that's something that I hope somebody else will do that research. I mean, I'm not researching name changing anymore, but I think that there was almost no research done on this before I started doing it. And I actually kind of hope that other people will do it in other places and other spaces and find out if there are similarities or differences. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question.
I think the only other question I saw, if I and Grace will let me know if I've missed anything, but there was a request that you repeat the joke about the Hollywood joke, because I probably interrupted you in the telling, to
Oh,
be fair.
well,
So
so there's the Hollywood joke, and then there's the typical, joke at Ellis Island, and they're very similar. I mean, so I don't know which one I should tell. I'll tell the one going to Ellis Island, and then I'll I'll explain the version that was immigrant. But the version in Ellis Island is that there's an immigrant who's standing in line at Ellis Island. He's waiting to be seen by the inspectors, and he's very nervous. There's all kinds of commotion and bustle. He's very flustered. And so when he finally gets to the front of the line and the official says to him, "What is your name?" He says, "I Shane vergessen," which means in Yiddish, "I have already forgotten." And so the official records his name as Sean Ferguson or Shane Ferguson. And I'll tell you, when I tell this joke in groups of people, everybody knows this name, this joke. But I will say that the one going out Hollywood, I remember now, I got it a little bit off in the conversation. He's actually a Yiddish actor. He's an actor on the Yiddish stage in New York, and he's going to Hollywood to make his big break in the movies. And he's repeating. He like learns his name over and over and over again, and then he gets there to the producer, and then he says, "I forget him." It occurs to me too, Annie, if we don't have other questions, that maybe I could clarify the
Yeah, and Susan and
official spelling.
Stephen actually just reminded us to get to that. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so I really appreciate. I had a great conversation at a conference this December. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to pronounce his name. We had a very lovely conversation, but I never actually said his name, so I don't want to pronounce it incorrectly. But he did work on German naming on naming in I believe it was the German or the Austrian Empire. I believe it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But he did research and found that officials were giving names to Jews. So it was not that Jews, or at least in the sample that he was looking at, because he found actually one official who gave very unusual names that happened to date from where he was from, right?
Mm.
And so most likely it looks like officials did give names, but and that would explain maybe why Jews' names were so similar in a different way. They were easier, right? It was easier to just take two. Oh, now you're Applebaum and now you're Greenbaum, right? It was sort of a way to take these artificial names and put them together and make them more legible and easier to write and keep track. But they were I think it's really important to see that these were names that perhaps were being given to them by officials, or at least that's what the evidence that he found demonstrated. But they weren't necessarily ugly names, and it wasn't to humiliate or embarrass them. It was maybe what makes more sense in a bureaucratic society is that they were done to make it easier, right? That it was done. And really the reason they were doing this was to be able to keep track of Jews, to be able to tax them. And so that having names like this made that easier to do.
Great. And so I think there's a request for you to write in the chat the name of
I
the scholar
will.
you spoke to.
Absolutely.
And as you do that, I just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, sharing your research with us. I want to thank all of you watching for your questions and for the initial questions that even prompted this program from the beginning. Thank you so much. So many of you are already supporting the museum. Becoming a member is another way to support the museum. And of course, becoming a member enables you to visit time after time after time again. And as you probably know, we have over a dozen offerings for you to choose from, 8 family apartments, actually 8 tours of about a dozen different family apartments that allows you to learn about a century's worth of immigration and immigration on New York. I think today those stories are even more important for us to be able to understand the human element of immigration and migration, not just in the past, but how important it is today for understanding American society. So I want to thank Kirsten. I want to thank all of you. Our next program, actually, for those of you in New York City, we're partnering with the Film Forum, the wonderful venue where there's a whole 3 weeks, February 6th through 26th, a series on films that happened in tenements, tenement stories. So everything from the silent films to Yiddish films to Italian American by Martin Scorsese, Mean Streets, Godfather 2, Hester Street, and then silent films like Hungry Hearts by Andrzej Zerska coming to life. And many of these programs will have talkbacks afterwards with directors or with others who are there. Another really neat one is Heart of the Lower East Side, which is a 1979 film of Puerto Rican residents, mostly of the East Village, who have reclaimed tenements and recreated them. And all the tenants who were part of that will be at the film screening. So it's a really special series that enables us to do what we do every day at the Tenement Museum, look at daily life in the tenements. But here we'll be looking at it on the silver screen at our wonderful partner institution, the Film Forum. So I invite you to check that out. And also on February 18th, we're doing a program with WNYC on the Gilded Age and Black women in the Gilded Age, featuring Danae Benton, the wonderful actor who plays Peggy Scott. And we'll be exploring the world of Peggy Scott with the historian Leslie Harris and our research fellow Marquise Taylor, and moderated by Allison Stewart from all of it. So lots of things going on at the Tenement Museum, and we hope that you join us in the coming weeks. We hope you become members, and want to thank you for everything. And thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And yes, go to Lower Seattle Tenement Museum. It's fantastic. It's a great place.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye bye.